Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review. I'm Sheena Chestnut-Greitens, Editor-in-Chief of TNSR, and I'm here with our Executive Editor, Dr. Ryan Best. We're pleased to have joining us today two members of a roundtable that appears in the current issue of the journal, Lauren Sukin and Nicola Leveringhaus. They, along with 7 other authors, put together a roundtable discussion that focuses on navigating the new nuclear map, which is featured in Volume 8, Issue 4 of the journal. Lauren Sukin is the John Winnan Associate Professor in U.S. Foreign Policy at Nuffield College and the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Oxford. She is also a fellow at the Peace Research Center, Prague, in the Faculty of Social Sciences at Charles University, and a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Nicola Leveringhaus is a reader in international relations in the Department of War Studies, King's College London. She is also a research affiliate of Nuclear Knowledges at Adversaries Sciences Po and a board member for Basics NPT Monitor and the Nutri Project. Lauren, Nicola, welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, and thanks for joining us from the UK. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having us.
Ryan, over to you.
So, this quarter's issue of the Texas National Security Review features a roundtable discussion on the evolving global landscape of nuclear security, featuring a wonderful group of young scholars. Lauren, what prompted you and Rohan to put together this roundtable discussion?
Rohan and I had a conversation about how the nuclear landscape had really changed so much since most of our core theories of nuclear politics had really come about. And it's not just a question of now we live in a post-Cold War world, but that the dynamics that we'd come to accept over the last couple of decades no longer looked the same. There's this resurgence of competition with China's rise as a more powerful nuclear actor, which Nicola will talk about later today. We see a world that's both more multipolar and more polarized. There are all of these changes in domestic politics, and we see this, really sharply in the United States right now, but also across Europe and in East Asia and South Asia. And we were thinking, how much do all of these changes mean that we need to update our understanding of what the nuclear world looks like? So, with support from the Phelan United States Center at the London School of Economics, where Rohan is based and where I was based at the time, we put together a conference inviting a number of scholars to present their ideas about different regions where they had expertise and to talk about what patterns they saw in the nuclear politics in those regions. One of the things that really came out of that conversation was this idea that the changing landscape of nuclear politics had these similar features across these very disparate regions with different security concerns and different political dynamics, that domestic politics mattered so much more than we'd previously appreciated, and that there was this sense of interconnectedness where dynamics that were happening in one bilateral alliance were spilling over into others or had these impacts on these minilateral and multilateral forums. And so we decided that we should have some of the authors who had been part of that conference write up their insights and to give the sort of new geography of the nuclear world.
The collection of essays that you've put together is a really wonderful sort of survey of the current nuclear landscape, and I really appreciated the extensiveness that you're able to go into across the roundtable contributions. Nicola, I wondered if I could turn to you for a minute, because much of the change in the global security landscape, both in Asia, but also more broadly in the nuclear map, is coming from China. And so in your contribution to the roundtable, you note that China's rise as a growing nuclear power has really come hand in hand with a lot of domestic political changes witnessed under Xi Jinping. And so I wondered if you could talk to us about how we in the West can understand the ways in which Chinese domestic politics have driven military and foreign policy decisions like the changes in nuclear capabilities and posture that you described.
Yeah, thanks. I think when I took part in the conference, and it was a fabulous conference, by the way, that Lauren and Rohan put together, I think I had quite a passionate drive to bring in the domestic political element. I feel that the conversation about China's rise is a very technology focused, debate, necessarily so. I mean, if you've just watched the parade recently, and the technology that's on display there and so forth, it does need to have that technological element. But I felt like the role of domestic politics often gets drowned out in that conversation. So I think that was driving me at the conference, and it was driving me in the contribution to the roundtable. And I do believe that domestic politics do shape what's possible when we think about negotiation, when we think about engagement with China, both in the present, but also in what we can imagine for the future, right? So I think it has quite a lot of implications. And in China, there have been a number of sort of broader general changes in domestic politics that aren't necessarily about, changing nuclear strategy, but they have an impact on nuclear strategy, right? So they have this side effect. And I guess one of the big things I was trying to say in the roundtable and in the paper was that we've seen this general trend where nuclear weapons have come to acquire greater domestic value. And that's of note, right? That matters, that it didn't previously have so much purchase in domestic politics. Again, that affects how China enters into engagement, how it enters into negotiation with a country when it's talking about its nuclear weapons. And similarly, when it's making decisions, the domestic political environment for decision making, for influencing decisions, that's changed. There's been a contraction, right, that I talk about in the paper around the expert community. So these things are not so well known, I think, beyond obviously the big technology stories that we hear in the news about China. And so that was sort of the thing that was driving me in that paper.
Lauren, similarly, you talk a lot about how in authoritarian regimes, domestic political factors are playing an increasingly prominent role in shaping nuclear policy. But you also highlight in your piece that in democratic societies, public opinion and political polarization can both shape the nuclear future. Can you give us an example of how these domestic factors shape Western discourse on nuclear policy and nuclear threats?
Absolutely. One of the things that we want to point out when we're talking about the role of domestic politics is that the public across the world has increasingly formed and consistent opinions on nuclear policy. And this is true not just in authoritarian regimes that have really tried hard to illuminate the role of nuclear weapons as an element of prestige of regime security, but we see these same kind of themes emerge elsewhere. And as we start to see this turn in politics more broadly towards this kind of populist nationalism, nuclear politics are often a piece of that conversation. So if we think, for example, about Deepak Das's work on South Asia, in particular on politics in India, the rise of nationalism in India has coincided with this idea of nuclear weapons and military power more broadly being this essential tool of the state in this demonstration of influence in the world. And so that popular support for the government that is part of this package of views towards military policy matters in the nuclear realm. We might say something similar in the US as well. We've seen polarization on nuclear issues tear apart what might otherwise have been really practical policy solutions. We all saw what happened to the Iran deal and the swings that Trump has gone through from the first to second administration. These are informed by the landscape of domestic politics, maybe even more so than those international factors that we typically would think would matter in an area as specialist as nuclear policy. One of the things that we see in the roundtable is work by Jackie McNamara thinking about the changing landscape of nuclear politics in Europe. And here we have a situation in which popular attitudes about nuclear politics historically have mattered quite a lot. We've seen a history of protests in West Germany and Germany, for example, about its relationship with NATO, about stationing nuclear weapons there. And Jackie talks about this uncomfortability with having control of these weapons be in the hands of a United States whose domestic politics is changing. I think we see this echo throughout Europe right now. There are emerging conversations about proliferation, about additional forward deployment of tactical nuclear weapons, about a Euro deterrent or alternatives to the NATO infrastructure. Not all of these things are actually going to come to fruition, but the fact that these conversations are renewed and vibrant in places all across Europe, from Italy to Poland to Germany to France and the UK, tell us that something is upset about the balance that used to govern nuclear politics in Western Europe, and that there is this popular demand for a new way forward for safety from nuclear threats.
For the United States and the Western order, and I'm thinking about discussions I have heard in Washington, D.C., but also here in Texas, where we're recording from. The rise of China as a nuclear peer is one of the major factors that has really seemed to shift the way that the United States views nuclear deterrence, in that the world has shifted from a bilateral nuclear deterrence problem at the great power level to a trilateral or multilateral structure. And I'm thinking, for example, of the foreign affairs essay by two recent US government officials warning of the instability that comes with this sort of structure to the global nuclear order. And so I wondered, Nicola, can you talk to us about what this change might mean for Western nuclear policy, whether it's the United States or some of the other countries? In other words, what's the interaction or the effect of the changes that you're describing in your essay on some of the other pieces of the nuclear order that the Roundtable explores?
Yeah, I think it really builds on what Lauren's just been saying about some of the discussions in Europe. I mean, so I'm sitting in the UK, where in July there was a Northwood Declaration between the UK, France, and Germany, which I think was a pretty big deal, particularly for France, and reflects, I think, sort of an internal acknowledgement in Europe among NATO member states that the United States has perhaps talked much more openly about the challenges that China's growing material capabilities present for, extending deterrence simultaneously across two different theaters, Euro-Atlantic, Indo-Pacific, and the demands, technical demands, the political demands, how you do credibility and reassurance in that context moving forward. So I think the Northwood Declaration is a reflection of that. We might see more things like that moving forward. And I think the UK decision, for instance, to buy F-35As, right? I mean, that's a decision that's quite considerable as well. There have been other discussions in the UK even beyond that, right? So I think in Europe, at least not all of Europe, but many parts of Europe, and even more so in places like Poland and so forth, clearly you have an acknowledgement that for the United States, doing deterrence is harder than it was before. I think in the case of what that means materially, I think it's still very unclear. A lot of European states are still unclear. They're not speaking with one voice or entirely clearly about the rise of China still. Even in NATO still, they're not talking about it in the way, I think, with as much clarity as the US has been, even if there is polarization in the US. So I think we'll still yet to see that, right? And they don't quite use the same language as the United States when it comes to a multiple peer problem. But yeah, I think there are already changes that we're seeing, and then some of them are very real policy changes, right? Like the Northwood Declaration, for instance.
That's really fascinating. One of the themes I noticed in this collection of essays is that these essays demonstrate that nuclear decisions cannot be made in bilateral or regional vacuums. So, what should the global nuclear order look like in the future if policymakers make nuclear policy decisions considering this interconnectedness?
So, first, I want to build a little bit on what Nicola was saying about how Europe is tackling what we might call the three body problem or the two peer problem in the American literature on nuclear policy. I think Nicola is absolutely right that the challenge looks different from a European perspective. The language is different. China is referred to more as a competitor than an adversary. But at the same time, the rise of China as a nuclear threat to the United States poses a strategic problem for Europe. And that is, over the past decade, maybe 2 decades, the US has been trying to shift its focus to the Indo-Pacific. And there are real concerns about what happens if the US were to be embroiled in a war in that region and resources that Europe thought could be dedicated to its security are no longer available. And so we're seeing, even among these states that don't consider China a threat necessarily, that they have to think about what the implications are when the US is stretched between multiple adversaries. There's a second layer to that too, which is there's always the possibility of either direct collaboration or what I think is much more plausible, concurrent threats. And by that, we mean maybe there's coordination between Russia, China, North Korea, maybe even Iran. But more likely, what could happen in a moment of really intense crisis or global tensions are that these states take advantage of opportunities created in one region to enact more aggressive policies in another region. And so it is plausible, and it's something that American policymakers need to think about, what happens if there is a growing crisis in Europe and at the same time China decides, now is the time to expand its maritime claims, or if there is a crisis involving the US and China and Taiwan, would North Korea take that opportunity to take action thinking maybe the US doesn't have the will or the resources to fight multiple conflicts at once? And so that's putting real pressure on American nuclear strategy, and across the world we're seeing different different countries deal with this in different ways. So we no longer have this scenario of countries have to think about their bilateral relationship with the US and that's it, but American allies and partners also need to think about the broader network that the US is entangled in. Another way in which we see this kind of multipolar competition shape the nuclear environment is states and countries, regions that have to think about their place within this competition in terms of technology acquisition. And we might think, for example, about Luis Rodriguez's work in the Roundtable, which talks about US-China competition over nuclear energy in Latin America, and argues that China is making these increasingly palatable pitches for its expanded technological influence, and the US really hasn't kept up. There's been this assumption that Latin America is in Washington's backyard and everything will be fine. And we're seeing that maybe the US needs to think more strategically about those relationships and how to build them in a positive direction rather than just trying to avoid this competition, or focus on other regions of the world while letting go of states that have been close partners of the US for quite a long time. Our contribution in the Roundtable on the Middle East also talks about this dynamic and points to Russia, China, and the United States all competing for contracts to build nuclear energy facilities in the Middle East, and how important it really is who wins those contracts or not, right? Who shapes the future and the security of these facilities will depend on that competition. And this is something that the US needs to think about if it's trying to make sure that it maintains this sort of leverage and influence and a vibrant nuclear energy export sector. But it's also something that all of these other countries who might be interested in nuclear power have to think about. Where are they going to fit into this global spectrum of competition?
So I heard three different sort of pieces of the puzzle about the American role in shaping other countries' sense of interconnectedness and their trade-offs and the way that they think about global nuclear order. Let me potentially throw a fourth layer in there and just ask you to react to it and think about how, or reflect on how it might be shaping countries' calculations. And that is that the Roundtable also brings up the point that changes during the Trump administration may have led to concerns about the credibility of American security guarantees across the world. And so that's a little bit different than resource trade-offs, right? It's a sense of what are the United States' willingness to provide extended deterrence, provide global security. So in a world where we're already thinking about resource trade-offs and strategic simultaneity and the underlying distribution of technological capabilities shifting, how then do we layer in and think about American foreign policy and the sort of discretionary choices that either generate or limit American credibility? How does that factor into this complicated picture?
So my own research has focused a lot on this question. What is credibility in alliances and in nuclear alliances specifically? And how is this something that the United States can manage? I think one thing that often gets oversimplified in our study of credibility is this idea that you're credible if you have all of the capabilities to follow through on your threats and you show some level of resolve. You have tripwire troops, or you say that you care about this country, or you're part of a treaty alliance. And in reality, credibility is much more complicated and much more deep. I think credibility is really about a match of preferences. Do you have the same level of risk tolerance when it comes to nuclear threats? Do you believe that your ally is going to do what you want them to do when you want them to do it, and is not going to take those actions in situations where you don't want them? And what I found in my own research is that unpredictability that we've seen as characteristic of the Trump administration is really quite a big problem for credibility. Not because the US force posture has fundamentally changed in some way, but because the US is not signaling resolve in the same way that it used to. The Trump administration has repeatedly emphasized its skepticism of alliances, including NATO, even while maintaining its relationship and its focus on Europe and continuing to support at varying degrees at varying times Ukraine and its fight against Russia. Those questions about how much the United States is interested in Europe matter in terms of credibility. And at the same time, the Trump administration has also sometimes signaled a kind of erratic willingness to go quite far. We just had recently Trump talking about how Ukraine should take back all of its territory, or that it could take back all of its territory. And you have to ask these questions about, is Trump the leader that countries in Europe really trust to use force to the right degree at the right time, neither abandoning Europe at a moment of crisis nor starting a conflict that is unnecessary in an attempt to project power really strongly. And this is not just a problem in Europe. We have the same dynamics appear in the Indo-Pacific, where Taiwan, South Korea, Japan have to wonder about whether Trump is really reliable and not just able to follow through on commitments, but really understands the set of preferences and the way that these countries understand their security environment. I think we are at a nexus point where there's a lot of anxiety in American allies and partners about what credibility looks like moving forward. And we're starting to see these conversations about how to either embed relationships more deeply so that there's more conversation and that understanding can be built and solidified, or looking towards alternatives. What might US allies and partners need to have if, in fact, US credibility does continue to diminish?
Can I just add to the conversation? It's not in my paper, but I think this is a powerful point about how the credibility may be changing, right? And how that affects the Indo-Pacific. I think for a long time, at least for some analysts, there was an unspoken sort of assumption that high credibility in US extended commitments to Indo-Pacific allies and partners like Japan, like South Korea, for instance, was actually very good for the regional ordering because it signaled to China that these countries would not develop nuclear weapons, that they were somewhat satisfied with those relationships. And so there is this sort of side effect that goes beyond that relationship between the US and their ally and partner, right? Which is, what does that say to China? And of course, China has always had, in my view, a very shaky relationship with the principle of non-proliferation anyway. And I think it's unclear whether it always believed in that guarantee, historically as a strong one. But it was an argument that was used, and it was a popular argument to say that the US role in the region is important for many reasons. And one of the reasons is that they provide a credible extended guarantee to these countries, and these countries won't therefore go nuclear. And so the question is, if that credibility is waning and changing, and China, like all of us, is perceiving that to be the case, and you see that with the Washington Declaration and so forth, what does that do to China's own thinking, right? I mean, if the United States can't maintain credibility in the same way that it did in a satisfying way for these countries in the region, and the prospects of proliferation in those regions are therefore higher, how does that then in turn impact China's own calculations, right, about its nuclear force size, its structures and deployment choices and so forth? So I think there are these added layers which are complicating credibility even further and do need to be fed into understanding China's own position in the region as well. And I think this argument that extending nuclear deterrence is an important non-proliferation tool, I think it's getting diluted right at the moment, right? And in China, there's this view that it isn't a non-proliferation tool because it's not working, and the US credibility here has been weakened considerably, right?
Absolutely. And my own research would suggest that the attempt to use credibility as a non-proliferation tool has been ineffective. And we've seen this turn towards interest in proliferation in South Korea, but also in recent work I've put out, we see substantial interest in proliferation in Taiwan and also in Indonesia, right? A country where proliferation is highly unlikely, but the interest in proliferation should tell us a broader story about the changing dynamics of the region and these questions about what nuclear security needs to look like as we see the region evolve.
Can I follow up on that and just draw out something that comes up in a number of the roundtable contributions, but is a little bit paradoxical given the conversation we've just been having? And that's at the same time, there are these questions being raised in allied capitals about limits on US power, either resource or because there's a three-body problem, or for other factors, credibility and other things. The United States is moving forward, or has moved forward, with a couple of new nuclear security arrangements in the form, and each of which is a little bit different. But you look at AUKUS, you look at the Washington Declaration, the trilateral cooperation between the United States, Japan, and Korea, which has a nuclear component to it, and the emerging ties between NATO and the Indo-Pacific, some of which involve European nuclear powers, for example. So So it's interesting to see these new forms of cooperation at a time when other aspects of the order seem to, at least qualitatively, be being called into question. So I wondered if you could talk about how you see each of these arrangements or attempts at new forms of organizing cooperation. How are they also contributing to the shifting global nuclear order?
I think these new security arrangements are part of this broader pattern that we've been talking about, where the US it's being forced to look more deeply at Indo Pacific security as China increases its nuclear arsenal and is looking for arrangements to try to deter China. And at the same time, has its allies questioning the security that comes from previous allied arrangements, and the US has to try to shore up its relations in these various new ways. So, to make that a little bit more concrete, we can think about something like the Washington Declaration. The Washington Declaration is meant to reassure South Korea as it started to have, increasing worries about its security commitments from the US and whether or not it really had the support it would need in the event of a nuclear crisis with North Korea. But the Washington Declaration, as much as it has tried to do things like institutionalize deeper consultation and build out stronger cooperation, we still see this crisis of faith. And that may be because the things underlying the crisis of faith are just so strong that this new institutional arrangement is only part of the equation and we need much more. Or it could indicate that what is needed is something that goes beyond South Korea, whether that's the US continuing to enforce its reputation for credibility, for understanding and caring about its alliances around the world, or drawing South Korea into other regional ties. And we see this in, for example, the cooperation between South Korea, Japan, and the United States tries to balance against emerging cooperation between China, Russia, and North Korea. But of course, there are longstanding tensions between Korea and Japan that have complicated these efforts. And there are questions about what this relationship will look like moving forward. At the same time, the US has tried to bring in the UK and France, and to some degree NATO, into its Indo Pacific relations. We see this with, for example, the AUKUS Pact and NATO's emerging cooperation in the Indo Pacific. It's mostly been an observer role, but we're starting to see those ties grow. I think that reflects a recognition that the US role is changing and that the US is facing these two adversaries, that its allies need to understand that political environment. But these elements of cooperation have also had challenges. There's not been nearly as much progress as one might have hoped on the technological developments that underlie the AUKUS agreement, and they've run into both international sort of coordination challenges and really serious domestic challenges in trying to get some of this technological innovation off the ground. So while I think these all point in the right direction, in order to make these relationships stronger, the US has to really invest in the underlying infrastructure of alliances, not just the alliances on paper, but regular exercises, regular consultation, scientific and technological exchanges. It has to do all of that, but it has to do that consistently and robustly. And we have bits and pieces, I think, more than a really comprehensive image that says, yes, the US is focused on the Indo Pacific and it's willing to support all of the different mechanisms that are needed for that influence to be a reality.
I mean, there's also a flip side to this, of course, right, which is things like the Russia DPRK agreement, which I think did shake the region up quite a bit, and not just the region. And I think China was not particularly happy with that arrangement either. And so there are other things like the recent Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan agreement, and so forth, whatever the details are of that. So I think there is a flip side to some of these sort of NATO Western-led arrangements that we're talking about. What's interesting is that China isn't necessarily in any of these particularly, even though it's, as you said at the beginning, it's at sort of at the root of many of these things, but it's not actually leading on sort of new institutional arrangements, however informal they may be, and so forth. So that may happen in the future, we don't know. But at the moment, there are alternative, non-sort of liberal democratic arrangements that are happening that are also shaping the order of things, right? And not just for the sort of the Western liberal countries as well, right? As I said, China wasn't particularly happy and isn't particularly happy with Russia DPRK security arrangements, right, as they stand now. Wasn't particularly happy with North Korean involvement in the war in Ukraine either, directly as it were. So I think there is a flip side that we see a lot of different sort of new patterns emerging on both sides in terms of nuclear ordering. And China may very well in the future. I think it has a huge capacity. So I think I wanted to sort of come in earlier and say that this is not just about its military capacity and its military growth. It has, in general, huge economic, diplomatic capacities, industrial capabilities, of course, which means paired with its ability to be quite opportunistic, right, and to seize opportunities when they come around, means that probably China has quite deep pockets, right, in the sense not just in monetary terms, but in the ability to do things institutionally and so forth in the future in ways it's never done before. So I think China has sort of biding its time, using that pun, because it could do a lot more than it's actually currently doing in terms of the ordering process institutionally and so forth.
I think Nicola is absolutely right about this. And what we see in response are all of these different types of hedging against those possibilities that China might be able to enact as we move forward. Those security arrangements that we talked about between the US and its partners in the Indo Pacific region are part of that. But it's not only US initiatives that we're seeing. Deepak Das's work in this roundtable, for example, talks about how India's nuclear posture is developing with an eye towards China, maybe more so than had been the case. And Deepak talks about how policy decisions that are partially about growing competition with Pakistan also are starting to look more like developing the technologies and capabilities and posture that might be needed if there were growing competition with China. So while this is primarily a Western phenomenon, and we've kind of been talking about this as a world in which US allies and partners have to make these really sharp decisions about how to prioritize between a China that's increasingly resourced and able to fill in some of those gaps in the international order, and a US that may be showing these kind of signs of retrenchment, it's a complicated decision for each of these states, and they're facing a really uncertain future when they think about how China might evolve moving forward.
It's interesting, considering the adversarial nature of nuclear cooperation amongst Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Several essays in this collection highlight concerns about coordinated nuclear coercion that could lead these states to develop nuclear strategies that increasingly challenge the US-led security architecture. How might this impact the national security of the US and Europe? How should we be thinking about this?
So I had talked a little bit earlier about the possibility, not necessarily of coordinated nuclear coercion, but maybe concurrent nuclear coercion. We see this a little bit in the work that Do-Young Lee brings to the roundtable, where he talks about some of the lessons that North Korea appears to have drawn from the Russo-Ukrainian war and what that means for South Korea. That reflection, I think, is part of a broader conversation that's happening all around the world as we now have this opportunity to really observe the great powers in competition in real time, and states are reevaluating their own security and their place in that alignment. Do-Young talks about how South Korea is trying to develop its strategy, keeping in mind the evolving competition with North Korea, its expanded resources, its commitment to scaling up its nuclear arsenal. And this is, I think, a good example of how concurrent challenges complicate a relationship that the US has previously thought of as much more straightforward. The US posture towards North Korea has really been somewhat isolated, thinking of this as a more limited engagement that would not necessarily have to spiral into competition with other states. But I think there's increasingly a recognition that if North Korea chose to be more expansionist or more aggressive in its policy, that it would do that at an opportunity where the US is distracted by conflicts elsewhere around the world. And of course, South Korea is in this interesting position in the region where it would not necessarily be willing to contribute its resources or maybe some elements of its basing if the US were caught up in a Taiwan contingency, for example. So from a planner or strategist perspective, you have to think about what happens if there is a Taiwan contingency, right? If there's this broader conflict in the region. And at the same time, the US has to dedicate resources to this more specific North Korea-South Korea conflict. I think that's the kind of dynamic that we're seeing when we think about how the US and Europe are tackling these challenges. They are trying to plan for a world in which there may be multiple wars going on at once involving multiple nuclear powers. And that is a much more complicated planning scenario that might require new capabilities or new arrangements. And one side of the debate seems to be arguing that the solution to this is to have a new suite of capabilities. Others might argue that it's more a question of relying on conventional assets to fill some of that warfighting capacity and emphasizing the strategic role of nuclear weapons. But whichever way you sort of treat this strategy problem, it raises a new set of contingencies, a new set of scenarios that the United States and its allies and partners need to deal with. And they need to revisit whether the security arrangements that were designed for bilateral competition in separate regions, whether those really hold up in today's more tripolar and multipolar world.
I would add that I don't always look at it through the nuclear coercion lens, but I think definitely in terms of nuclear signaling, strategic communications, and what, for instance, China sees Russia doing in the war in Ukraine over the course of since 2022, how NATO have responded to the use of nuclear signaling and sort of China's own interpretation of that. I mean, it's watching that very closely, and I think, and I've said this elsewhere, I feel like that the war in Ukraine has opened a box somewhat around strategic communications and signaling, which wasn't opened quite so widely before. And that does have some unsettling implications, right? Again, it goes back to that comment I made about China having deep pockets. There are many things that China has not yet done, including in the nuclear coercion signaling space, that it might be inspired to do, in the belief that actually that was a very useful way of leveraging itself in a position or maximizing its interest in a particular conflict situation with NATO or the United States. So I think that's an uncomfortable new sort of reality that didn't exist before. So how China watches Russia, but also DPRK, watches Iran, engage with the US, with NATO, is very important to China, right? And it will want to, I imagine, gather as much information as possible and allow these countries probably to test those waters way before it tests those waters with the United States itself.
I wanted to come back to something that we touched on a moment ago that I think is really interesting to try to bring into this conversation. And that is, we've focused a bit on the challenges of the durability and the effectiveness of the new arrangements that the United States and its allies and partners are involved in, whether that's the Washington Declaration and trilateral cooperation in Asia or AUKUS. But there's this question of the effectiveness of coordination among the potential nuclear adversaries of the United States and its security partners. And so I was struck, Nicola, a moment ago by your comment about China's ambivalence toward the Russia-North Korea cooperation. There's been a bit of a tendency to describe all of these actors as aligned with each other, but the reality is they have some coordination challenges among those actors as well, and alignment of interests may not translate into effective coordination at every step along the way. So I wanted to probe that a little bit, Nicola, if I could, that this idea of expanded security cooperation between Russia and China on certain conventional or defense industrial base pieces of the puzzle, and then you also have Russia and North Korea collaboration on other pieces of the puzzle, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all three are operating in perfect coordination or even are happy about the deepening collaboration between the other two. And so I guess the question is, how should we think about this mix of what appears to be deepening alignment, but still some hesitation or ambivalence about the nature of that alignment among this set of actors that the United States has to think about and plan for and account for in its nuclear policy?
I think one way of looking at it is, to say that they don't actually need to be allied formally, right, in order to, pose significant challenges for the US, for NATO. They don't need that layer of a formal treaty and to have sort of even a shared sort of set of abilities and command over shared capabilities or something like. They don't actually need that layer, as sort of unsettling as that layer would be, in order to present challenges, right, for NATO and the United States. So I think it's important to say that. I think, though, that if you look again at the parade, you know, in the optics, you know, the pictures where you saw the three leaders side by side, I mean, I think there were some very different interpretations of that. My interpretation of that was not that this was, you know, sort of a three-way alliance in the formation. I think actually it was actually Xi Jinping in the middle, very much saying that we're actually different than you and we're actually better than you. We're not the same. And we have material capabilities that are considerable and they have the ability to grow, right? And neither DPRK nor Russia can say quite the same. Also, of course, China's convening power is much greater diplomatically, economically than these other two. So I think that was a reminder of that for the world. I'm not sure that was how it was interpreted, and everybody have their own view. But I mean, we all know the history in terms of technical cooperation between China, Russia, and the DPRK is very complicated, and it doesn't suggest that you know that there's going to be this linear upward path, right, in the future. I think China is very cautious of deepening its commitments in certain sensitive areas and technologies. There are some areas where it's very difficult for China, and turning to Russia is very helpful, right? So if you think about radar, satellite, space capabilities, perhaps. But there are other capabilities where I think it would be actually very reticent. It would be very reluctant to share too much information, not least because it doesn't know what the outcome of the war in Ukraine will be and the outcome of Putin himself, right? And I think it would be very wary of sharing any sensitive information that could fall outside of Russian hands to, you know, countries that it doesn't want those countries to know about. So I think China is actually very cautious about deepening, you know, cooperation in technical spheres. It also has this wider narrative, right, which is not dissimilar to what Deepak's written about in his piece on India, right, for the Roundtable, which is this wider narrative of self-reliance. And it's very popular domestically to say we did this ourselves, right? We did this against the odds. And, you know, we don't need an AUKUS, right? We don't need some sort of technology enhancing arrangement with two other countries or three other countries, right? We don't need that. We can do that on ourselves. It's a very powerful statement. It's a very popular statement. So I think there are different things that point to China being actually very cautious and being very bespoke about the cooperation it does, particularly with Russia, less so with DPRK because the DPRK has less to offer China. But for the DPRK, it's different, right? Because China just doesn't want to turn DPRK into an enemy on its border. And it wants to have that relationship there in place, not least because things are changing in terms of the wider US relationship with ROK and Japan and so forth. So I think that they matter to China in different ways, and not necessarily I think we should expect this great alliance to be announced because it's not necessarily necessary, right, for China, and it's not reason for the US and NATO states to change their policies. It's already having a great deterring effect and posing serious security challenges to these countries.
Let me maybe follow up with one more question about China and its role, and then turn it over to Ryan to take us back to the global level to wrap up. But I wanted to return to something that you wrote about the interactivity or potential interactivity between the United States nuclear posture and planning policy changes and what China is doing. And so in your essay in the Roundtable, you argued that China's nuclear buildup is driven in part by perceived vulnerability to quantitative improvements in the US arsenal, including things like ballistic missile defense and conventional counterforce capabilities. And so this raises, you know, some really important questions for policymakers about how to think about necessary changes to the United States capabilities that would or would not contribute to a further interactive dynamic or a spiral with the PRC. And so I wondered if you could comment briefly on how US and other Western nations policymakers should think about this potential interactivity as they look at changes to nuclear posturing capabilities.
So I think a lot of it has to do with communication and at many levels, like how the US, how NATO states communicate the capabilities they have, what they're intended for, and what security they provide beyond the United States and their national sort of interests. I think, as I said earlier, I think China attaches a greater political value, and part of that is prestige, to capabilities. So if the US and NATO states are talking about capabilities in prestige terms as well, This again has a knock-on effect in China, right? Which could force China to talk differently about its capabilities in ways it hasn't previously as well. Again, something we've been accustomed to. China, since 2016, 2017 has sought to declare itself or becoming a world-class military power. And so the narratives that are attached to that, they can be attached to specific technologies, and you can see the narrative developing along those lines, right? So I think, recently the US Congress have been to China, right, to try and establish communication. I think that's the right approach. I think having communication channels, having a dialogue, and not just between militaries, but if possible between scientific communities, I think is very, very important. I think, without going over the history of US-China relations, but really since things like the Cox Report from the late 1990s, the end of the lab-to-lab talks between the US and China, these have all been a major loss, I think, in terms of talking through specific capabilities. And really, it's very helpful, particularly at the science-to-science level, to have those conversations. Cuts out a lot of sort of misunderstandings, which very, very knowledgeable foreign ministry, State Department people can have, but really it's better to have those conversations at science to science levels, right? And again, this builds into my broader point in the paper, which is that where are the scientists in China in terms of the strategic community, right? Because there is this other development happening in China, which I think is very unsettling, which is this contraction of the knowledge community, the expert community in its different forms, right? And that includes nuclear scientists. Some of these are now quite old. Some of these have sort of retiring from the scene, but some of these have a huge amount of knowledge about capabilities and are very important, right, in a conversation with the United States, but don't maybe have the influence they once had in shaping senior level thinking in the party in China, right, the Communist Party. Instead, you'll have other figures, maybe defense industry and so forth. So there are different people to talk to in China, and I just hope that the United States and other NATO member states are able to sort of identify who to talk to. It's not necessarily a military to military conversation, actually, with China. So having conversations science to science, maybe industry to industry, is, I think, more important than ever in terms of talking through the technologies and the capabilities.
I think Nicola's points here are really great. And I just want to emphasize that the themes that I think Nicola has pulled out are true beyond the US-China relationship. Nicola talks about how when the US positions nuclear weapons as this object of prestige, as the only solution to nuclear challenges, it's not just the US adversaries that are hearing that message. We see that language echoed in, for example, the South Korean conversation about wanting to develop nuclear weapons, or these conversations we're starting to see in Europe about potential interest in proliferation or other alternative deterrent arrangements. And similarly, Nicola's point about how important it is to maintain trust, even in the face of crises, to have these connections between governments. I think one of the true lessons of the Cold War is that it is that scientist to scientist connection, the friendships between diplomats in the US and USSR that enabled things like arms control to emerge. I worry that we don't have as deep of a bench in the US-China context, but also that those relationships in the US-Russia context have really been hurt in the last couple of years, and that it's important to maintain those when the US needs to do signaling to enhance its deterrence. That it has to have a way to communicate signals effectively, and without a diplomatic corps, or without a State Department that is strong and fully staffed and has experts that have connections with their counterparts across the world, it's really difficult to do signaling in a successful way, and deterrence ultimately relies on that communication.
So I'd like to bring this, kind of background to grab everything together. As I look back on this group of essays, I really pick out two common themes that include the centrality of domestic political drivers and the cascading effects of nuclear dynamics across interconnected states and regions. I was just wondering if you could wrap up the discussion by talking about how this two-level framework can help us understand this nuclear deterrence posture across the globe and how everything is interconnected.
I think we're in a world that is far more complex and multipolar and adversarial than we were even just a few years ago. It's a world that is marked by changes in domestic politics in the United States, but also around the globe, and a world where competition between the United States and its allies, and perhaps on the other hand, a suite of adversaries who are expanding their relationships, maybe not into a true alliance, but certainly into some some degree of collaboration or understanding, that competitive dynamic has widespread implications. One of the things that we really wanted to bring out of this roundtable was to question this idea that I think is implicit in a lot of the nuclear literature that really puts the US at the center. And I think in a world in which the US role in the nuclear order is changing and maybe much more diminished or much more conditional moving forward, we're seeing US allies and partners start to think about what decisions they have to make when the US is less central. We're seeing questions about what parts of the international order that normally don't have a major role in nuclear policy, like places like Latin America, how they're going to maybe take more of a leadership role or how they're going to sort themselves in this world of competition. And for Europe, I think this crisis is particularly pressing as we start to see countries try to think about what the future of European deterrence looks like when the role of the United States is really different. And so you'll see, one thing that's perhaps a bit notable about this roundtable is we don't have an essay on US posture. Instead, what we want to contribute is this idea that there are all of these other actors in the world with their own understanding of these changing dynamics, their own domestic political incentives, and their own place in the world order. And that if we're to think about policy holistically, and even if we're going to think about what the US needs to do, then we need to understand that the US perspective is not the only one, and that all of these other adversaries, partners, allies have complicated incentives and incentives that are evolving just as much as US posture is evolving.
I think that's a great point to close us out on as we think about challenges facing American foreign policy and American national security. Those decisions also can't be made in a vacuum. They have to be made with a realistic understanding of how other actors in the international system perceive and are likely to react to what the United States is doing, which may or may not be what American policymakers either perceive is likely or would want those other actors to react in. So really appreciate you all joining us for this conversation today. I know we've just barely scratched the surface in our conversation today. So I would commend the full roundtable to everybody who is able to access it online on our website at tnsr.org. Thanks for joining us on Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review. Our guests today have been Dr. Lauren Sukin and Dr. Nicola Leveringhaus, two of the roundtable contributors of Navigating the New Nuclear Map, a roundtable which, as always, can be accessed for free on our website, tnsr.org. Lauren, Nicola, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen, and you can always find more of our work at our website, tnsr.org. Today's episode was produced by TNSR Digital and Technical Manager Jordan Morning and made possible by the University of Texas System. This is Sheena Chestnut Greitens and Ryan Vest. Thanks again for listening.